All right, so I wanted to have a really quick uh, lecture. I'm going to try to make this one fairly short, but I wanted to talk about food webs, and we're going to continue on with this modified landscape and the uh, the island biogeography theory that I've been talking about, and we talked a little bit about managing the landscape. And I also want to talk to you about food webs and how novel they are now, and think about this in some different contexts. So one thing I wanted to point out is biological control, and this is essentially this idea. If we have an agriculture, this is a soybean plant, we have a pest of that soybean plant. This is an aphid, one of the common pests, and ladybugs are the predator of that. So the idea with biological control is that we could use insects that are the enemy of our enemy to help produce more plants. And essentially what that is a trophic cascade, right? So the the ladybug eats aphids, which has a negative impact. The aphid eats plants, which has a negative impact. So, because the ladybug eats aphids, the ladybug indirectly has a positive effect on the plant, right? So this is a pretty important process in agriculture. Reduce if we have really strong biological control agents, these predators, that can have a strong positive effect on agricultural production and a really positive effect on some of the things that we do, like herbicides and pesticides. It can reduce the need for things like that we don't necessarily want to be applying on the landscape. So having this intact is pretty important. When I was talking about uh, a lot of the practices that we are talking about, I think I ended on pollinators last time, but when I was talking about the pollinators, the same sort of things apply with a lot of the other beneficial insects. And when I'm saying beneficial insects, I mean things that are positively affecting agriculture, but they're also making the system more diverse, which generally has a positive effect on everything, on all the functions, right? But it certainly has a positive effect on wildlife, having diverse communities of plants and insects. So when we're establishing these field borders and some of these farm bill programs, implementing those and creating habitat for wildlife, we're also creating habitat for a lot of beneficial insects. Okay. The biggest enemy of an insect is another insect, and they're really good at controlling one another. So when we're using biological control, we're essentially trying to enhance that, right? Bugs eat bugs. They either directly eat them as predators or they parasitize them, or we have parasitoids. So you can look those up if you're interested in that. But I've put a couple of really interesting examples. If you haven't looked into how cool insects are, I mean, they really are pretty awesome. They do all kinds of really cool things. So I'm going to show you some of those. So a lot of you, when you're thinking about what I'm biological control, you're probably thinking about directly eating, and something like this where the spider has caught a grasshopper and it directly is eating it. Uh, there are also examples. This is another really cool example where we're just directly eating it. Uh, Another one, this is a larvae of an insect that's eating an aphid that's on a soybean leaf, so that's a really good thing. Another cool example, lots of really cool ones out there. True bug eating another true bug. This one is kind of weird though. It's a parasitoid, right? It's laying an egg on it, and then basically the egg hatches and eats the insect inside out. So that's what we're talking about right here. This one, the wasp injects its eggs into this nymph, and it does the same thing. Here's an example where a parasitoid wasp laid its eggs in this caterpillar, and all these worms are crawling out of it. Some of this is really gross, but it's also really cool to think about. These are all exoskeletons that are hollow from the wasp that parasitized it, and they crawled out of the aphid bodies. So all kinds of really cool ones like this where you can see a lot of cool examples. Um, so there have been studies after study after study showing that these things have really important effects on the way the system functions, right? And when we're thinking about conservation efforts, we've got to think more broadly about what we're doing on the landscape. And when we're increasing habitat for wildlife, we're simultaneously doing it for a lot of these beneficial insects. And this can have cascading effects on the landscape, not just on agricultural production, but also on the way the whole system is functioning. So it's pretty important for us to understand what we're trying to do in this landscape in terms of biological control is to increase, or in other words, make, you see how I bolded this here, we're trying to make that relationship, the predation relationship, much stronger so that we have a stronger positive effect on plants, right? That's something that landowners who are, or agricultural producers, can get behind. And at, understanding those processes and how field borders are going to affect agricultural production, not only by having pollinators closer, but by also increasing the strength of biological control, only helps us advance that mission of getting more habitat on the ground that ultimately benefits wildlife. Another thing to consider on top of that is there, if you look in an ag field, so I don't know what's going on here. Hang on. Okay, here we go. If we look in an agricultural field, we can start planning out these field borders like this, and with those incentive programs and the idea that we can increase pollination success and biological control, which ultimately benefits the producer on production of and the agriculture that it's surrounding. Those are all benefits, right, that we're getting. So you can see here's some of the things that we might apply on this landscape. Another thing that's really important to understand in this landscape is a lot of times the areas that we are trying to restore, like if you're looking at this landscape, essentially we're what we're the colors mean is how much the landowner makes from planting that particular spot in their grain of choice, whatever, soybeans or corn or whatever. Notice there are a bunch of places on this that are red or orange or yellow, or well, yellow, they're making a little money, but red, you see there are negative numbers on here for the red and orange. The landowner is literally planting that in corn right here and losing money to do it, right? That's pretty incredible to think about. So why would they do that? Why do you think they would do that? Think about that. They're that literally every single field, every agricultural field has places in the field where the owner is actually planting it at a cost. They're not making money by doing it. So this is something I think about quite a bit because we all do this all the time. It's kind of like an instinct of ours. And one of the reasons that we see this happening so pervasively is because it's easier. Now, let me give you an example of this. My dad loves cutting the grass. Now, I personally absolutely hate cutting the grass. If you come around my house, my yard always looks like a weedy mess, and everybody's wondering why don't you go cut the grass? And it's because I hate it. It seems like such a waste of time to me. I mean, you go out and cut it, and then a week later it's the same height again, and I just like the whole time I'm doing it, I'm sitting there thinking like, how much of a waste of time is this and resources? So I don't like cutting the grass, but my dad loves cutting his grass. And one year I learned my lesson now, but one year I bought him an apple tree. And I was like, man, he loves trees. He loves growing stuff. I'm going to plant it in his yard and he's going to love this. And, he's going to be so happy about this gift. And it was one of those where several apple varieties have been grafted onto one root stock. So he's going to have all these different kinds of apples and everything. And I planted it, and at first, he was really nice about it. He's like, oh man, I really, thanks for the gift, whatever. Probably a month into that, he started complaining about that apple tree. He complains about it all the time, and it's because it made it more difficult for him to cut the grass because now he has to go around that apple tree all the time. So that's the same kind of thing that's happening in these agricultural landscapes. The landowner is trying to make it as square and easy to traverse, where you can even see the straight lines in the planting here, right? They want to make it as easy as possible at the least turns possible just to go across, and reducing that effort that it takes. Like, look how complex the field would get if you didn't plant all this red. Uh, that seems to be worth it to the landowner, but most of them don't realize how much money they're losing by doing that. And if you can point that out to them, and there are a lot of tools being developed now where we can actually figure out, like, there are tractors literally driving themselves by GPS now, and they're logging how much money is being spent on every square inch of this field and how much money is being gained from the harvest on it. Like, we can map it out. That's what you're seeing right here. You can map out exactly what part of the field is making money and what isn't, and we could actually target these areas for restoration with farm bill programs, right? So the landowner could take this part right here that is a wetland that's is so wet right there that the crops always die, and that's why it's not doing well. He's losing money by planting that. And this is a male landowner, so I'm saying he because of that. But this landowner is losing money right there. So if we could figure out where he is losing money and actually target that with the Farm Bill program, he could get paid to not plant that, not lose the money on it, actually gain money on it, and we'd get all the conservation benefit out of it. So there's a lot of different ways like this that we can think about this landscape dynamically and try to enhance wildlife habitat in it, and it actually benefit the agricultural producers that own the land that are having to give up some of their cropland to do it. So really important concepts uh, for you to think about. Another thing that I want you to think about is, here's an example. A lot of these conservation buffers will not be forests; they'll actually be grasslands, and particularly in upland sites, those grassland borders are really effective at creating wildlife habitat. And remember, we've been talking about a lot of our species of concern or grassland and or savanna obligate species, right? So having these kinds of things on the landscape are pretty important. And we've seen a lot of species like northern bobwhite and dickcissel and all these different grassland obligate birds respond really well. And the diversity of an agricultural landscape increases substantially when you have these in these different enrollment programs. There have been several studies evaluating the effectiveness, and they can be really effective. And another thing that's a benefit is they get really easy for us to manage. So this is with fire. Notice the fire, they didn't even have to put a fire break around it. It's already there naturally because of the agriculture. The problem that you could run into here is it makes it so easy that we have the tendency to just want to light the fire all the way around it, or go in, if we were disking to do this, to do all of it. And that's a problem. We really need to have a diversity of that disturbance. So a better approach would have been to take a couple patches of it and burn those, and then do that in different years so that you have multiple ages of since fire. So right now they're basically burning the whole patch at once. We should have probably they're going to burn the whole patch at once every 3 years, and instead we should have burned a third of the patch every year so that every piece of ground gets burned every 3 years, which is the rotation for this stand. But make sure that we have some diversity. These practices can be super impactful, and fire is a real benefit. But if we get all the way to this point where we're just trying to maintain the habitat, we can still mess it up. So it's important for you to understand when you're thinking about this landscape. So we've been talking about how great island biogeography is for a lot of different reasons, and we're going to go more into this. One of the students in my lab, she studies invasive species, and we're going to talk about that. She's going to talk about this more. But one of the problems with implementing this type of strategy that makes the landscape really easy to traverse and habitat accessible to wildlife is that it also makes it accessible to invasive species. I think wild pigs are one of the most important uh, ones in the South that this is exactly. So, Adrian, when she talks to you about her research, she's going to actually talk about wild pigs because that's what she's studying, and we're studying it from an island biogeography standpoint. I don't want to steal her thunder, but just know that when we implement these strategies in uh, in these management approaches, that is really critical to think about how it's going to infect or how it's going to affect the potential range expansions or colonization by invasive species like the pigs. And it certainly happened in a lot of our landscapes, and we can make it worse in this case. So there are a couple of ways that we might be able to deal with that. Remember, I talked about this small island effect. Well, if we could make patches that are big enough to accumulate most of the native species, but aren't big enough to where we start uh, getting some of those other invasive species, that could be one way that we could deal with this, right? There are ways that we could manipulate the landscape, or if we could find a distance that's far enough apart where most of the bird species might be able to go between. Remember, like we were talking about the habitat patches and having the stepping stones, we might be able to manipulate configurations like that where we could keep something like pigs from being able to colonize each of them, but still provide the habitat benefit for birds that can traverse it much easier. So lots of strategies like that. Another thing for you to think about, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about related to this, is you know the island geography not only predicts how many species are there, it has an extinction process, right? It predicts how vulnerable a species is to extinction. So if we use that in this theory, we could also use that to target eradication efforts in the landscape. And it makes things like wild pigs vulnerable because we can use the landscape configuration to figure out where the most vulnerable populations are. So, like if it was this red one right here, or these two red ones, they may be the most vulnerable populations. We would start there and try to get rid of all of those. And then that instantly makes the surrounding patches more vulnerable, and you just sort of work your way out with this epicenter of extinction. So pretty cool way that we could apply that to try to get rid of that problem that we have with invasive species, and wild pigs are only one example. I mean, for those of you that have been living in Florida for a long time, you know that Florida has a ton and tons and tons of invasive species, and it certainly is a problem. And one of the advantages of having a really fragmented landscape is that it might give us the opportunity to manage some of those species and get rid of them. Not that there's a benefit of fragmentation. That's not my point, but that's one of the silver linings, right? So another thing I just wanted to talk to you a minute about, and I posted a video related to this, and also want to have more discussion about novel food webs. And what I'm talking about, not only have we changed the landscape configuration by having things like agriculture that fragmented the landscape, we've also created a situation where we have all these invasive species in the mix, right? And that can change the way the system functions a lot. And it doesn't, just having one individual, or not one individual, one species added into a food web can really change the entire way that food web interacts. And hopefully in the video you'll understand how manipulating the food web just a little bit can change it a lot. And that's what I'm talking about with novel food webs in general. And what I want to discuss is, you know, we've manipulated the landscape to such a degree, both by changing the way that habitat is oriented, and also by adding species and subtracting species out of it, that we're really in a context that has changed all kinds of things. I mean, think about when we were discussing the passenger pigeon. I mean, that system is that food web has changed forever from that, and a lot of species are having trouble because of this novel food web context that we're in, and we're going to talk about it more in the discussion, but really important for us to think about how much we've influenced these food web dynamics and how complex that could be for us understanding how things will change when we implement conservation strategies. So keep that in mind when we're going through discussion, and also in some of these future lectures when we're talking about ways that we can manipulate the food web by adding or subtracting species, and how difficult it is for us to actually predict what the outcomes are going to be as a result. So appreciate you taking the time to watch this. Really enjoyed talking to you about this, and looking forward to the discussions on this topic. Hope to see you all soon.